Hola, Bernardos. It's time to take a look at the end of the 20th century, at least the part that kind of finishes out modernism. We're going to be looking at works that basically fit within the time period of the 1940s through the 1970s. As a matter of fact, I believe the works that you see on your screen have those exact dates in their titles, 1950 to about 1970. So think of this as the moment that the art world moves away from Europe, away from Paris, which is now in ruin, along with several other cities. Paris, not so much more, not as much so as, say, London and other places where actual fighting occurred. But it seems to lose its polish and shine as something that's more old world, and a brave new kind of art basically emerges in America. So we'll talk about AbX, or abstract expressionism, as kind of the first real American art movement. And we'll see the flow of information in the art world go away from Europe to America and more America to Europe now. So this is a real shift in your course. So let's begin with Willem de Kooning's Woman One, and I'll walk you through how we get here. You guys realize that most of the artworks that are picked by College Board are kind of like the apex or the high point of a tradition that they represent. And I really don't think, as your art history teacher, you can understand anything about de Kooning if you don't know what was going on around him at this time. So I wanted to show you, this is a timeline that I put together on the whiteboard and tried to map out the diversity of styles. It is like an explosion, pretty much, but it goes from left to right. And there's some really important concepts here. So I want to highlight some things for you to help you kind of clarify what's going on. 1945, we're really dealing with the end of World War II. It begins a new era of the Cold War, which you guys recognize from history and all your other classes that you're taking. It's a real turning point. It is as well for art history. It creates a whole lot of reaction where people begin to feel that they're no longer in control of the world around them, that anybody at any one point could punch a button and that would be the end of everything. So it creates a more charged sense of existentialism where people feel as if they bounce off of each other without any real idea, maybe that, life is all chance now. So that basically reflects itself in the artwork that comes right after the war here as being a little bit more ambiguous and a little bit more chaotic, and sometimes even a little bit more violent. So we're going to see that after the war. The process that happens here is people begin to start realizing art is a process, and it begins to become like a formal experiment. Clement Greenberg is an art critic who really had a big hand in creating this drive to reduce artwork to its barest, most honest elements. Get rid of narrative, get rid of the academic tradition. Those are the things that got us, where we were mid-century. So they have no place in the forward analysis. And what you get are a lot of people who come from Europe bringing that kind of thinking with them. 1913, we had the Armory Show. Later on, we would have support from New Deal programs that would bring artists from Europe to America. And these guys would become teachers of people like Jackson Pollock and others who would then begin to abstract even more. We go away from the academic system 100%. And what you see here is the rise of a gallery system, where now your job as an artist is to get shown in someone's typical New York gallery, get positive feedback from the press. And that's exactly what happens through this era as we get more and more and more minimal. Now, what we're going to start with is this right here. Basically, abstract expressionism. I want you to really make a note. This is the very first time that America takes the lead and is no longer just copying what Europe is pumping out, right? The modernism of the early 20th century would have a foundational kind of effect on what Pollock and his contemporaries would do, but they would take those influences and go several different directions. So we have gestural abstract expression where you can see the paintwork You can see the brushwork, and you can very much get a sense of where the artist went and what he or she did next as they moved over canvases, as they moved over them upright or on the floor, and made it really more like performance or action painting. Of course, you had sculpture that was being made at the same time that had similar characteristics, but the other branch of this was really a more colorful response, and that's chromatic abstract expressionism. So this is kind of where Helen Frankenthaler will fit. As we get further and further away from that idea, you'll see her down at the bottom. But it really is like an explosion. If we're no longer working or having to feel like we're working from the images of the natural world, then basically we can abstract from within. And that's really what abstract expressionism is. With abstraction like cubism, you get like a fracturing of the picture plane, looking at something from multiple sides simultaneously, but the image is still there. In expressionism, you get the color and the angst coming out and spilling out of the figure, and makes basically a way that seems to suggest there's an interior person underneath the surface we see in the real world, but still you see the person. When you put those two ideas together, what you get is a wide-ranging idea for subject matter that's no longer tied to the figure. And that's how we explain this response here, that people are now not tied to what we see. It's more tied to what we feel. And that comes from a deep kind of abstraction that we don't know where the source came from. Okay. So it begins the process of breaking art into process. And you can see that the reactions are going to get more and more diverse. All right. So the idea with this, we'll come back to that many times over, but I want to get to what's going on after World War II, just so you can see where Willem de Kooning, an artist like that, comes from. Post-war expressionism was a response primarily to the violence that had been wrought on Europe in World War II. So you get people like Francis Bacon doing these almost horrifying images of people stretched and extruded, sometimes looking like they've been manipulated and twisted, flesh that's basically deformed. And it's kind of a statement on the decay of the old world, right? Here is a portrait of his lover, and literally a guy who was a tortured murderer, as a matter of fact, actually went to prison, has his face contorted and pushed like flesh is suddenly malleable, right? You have pictures here of Francis Bacon. He basically had a fascination with printed media from dentist's office that showed you aberrations of human flesh. He studied the coloration of sides of beef and really put that into his work as a way to kind of deal with the angst that he was going through living in London after the war. You got to imagine the city is leveled. There is nothing left. It's a chaotic disruption. And what you get is a response that kind of is critical of the former administration here. This work called Painting literally lampoons Chamberlain, who had the policy of appeasement, trying to contain Hitler. He always went to these meetings with a black umbrella over his head, so it becomes kind of an icon of his administration and what it basically wrought on the face of Europe. So it's a chaotic response, and you can see people are trying to deal with, how do you make art after everything has been destroyed? So it really is a response to that kind of tragedy and loss. Dubuffet is another French artist. Bacon is English. This guy's French. And he coins the term art brut, trying to really break away all the academic tradition of representation, trying to basically draw like a kid's drawing. And he will use sand. He will use all kinds of things in his paint. He'll use very, very thick surfaces to kind of make this go backwards towards something that's like child art and cave painting. And that brutish kind of nature that really is difficult to look at, but in a way very, very honest and real, considering the times that people were in. So you get these fanciful, childlike drawings like this cow with the subtile nose. There's always wordplay as kind of a nod to Dada. So these guys are going to really be willing to play with their art and process. I love Giacometti. If you're going to talk about existentialism in a literature class, you really should remember these figures. Giacometti basically is Swiss, and he fought in World War II. And he tells stories of the fact that as an artist in that situation, he had to find a way to express himself. So he carried around a little matchbox. That had these figures he would make and contort inside the matchbox. They were just thin wire, and they kind of became a metaphor for the sculptural presentation of the human form, both male and female, that he uses as kind of stick figures to represent what has happened to humanity. It's like identity is nothing now. We are faceless, we are nameless, and that means that there's just this sense that we're wandering around on the plane of the earth without any kind of knowledge of what's going to happen to us next. The idea here with this work from the DMA, it's called Three Men Walking. And literally, what you have are figures who are on a plane. If you look at it from one angle, it looks like the figures are walking away from each other. And then if you turn it from another angle, it looks like they make a pyramid as if they're going to collide in the middle. It is all about the chance meeting of people in public spaces and how literally your life could change at the drop of a hat. And you really don't have control over that. You're bouncing around all over the place, trying to figure out which end is up, and your identity has been completely lost or hollowed out. So there's a lot of connection to that post-war expressionism as we get into proper abstract expressionism. These guys basically decided that they really couldn't make art the old way anymore. The figure is gone. The idea is process and color. And what you get are emigres like Joseph Albers, this German who taught at the Bauhaus, coming across to the US, bringing his concepts with him. This is his homage to the square, and it's a work that he did several times over with different color harmonies, trying to change the concept of how these colors relate and what they do to the viewer. Hans Hofmann was another German who came during the interwar years. This work known as The Gate, which he features that yellow idea. He's abstracting from nature, and it looks as if we've got a yellow gate, maybe a street scene of sorts where we're walking toward something that's our destination. But it's a loose narrative at best. The real idea is color harmony and process. So these guys are going to become the teachers. They, like Arshil Gorky, a Russian who emigres, brings first his figural art with him, but then explodes into these abstract bimorphic forms that are just basically delineated with a little black line on a field that we really can't tell. It's more an emotive response to a memory and not necessarily tied to anything we can see representationally. This is non-figurative art, and that's really what's pressing forward. Color harmonies, non-figurative art, things that reference memory but don't tell a story and just give you a sense of what's going on in the artist's mind. These would be the teachers of people like Jackson Pollock. And what you see here is with Jackson Pollock in the 1950s, a very reductive a process where he puts things like house paint, non-traditional implements like sticks and house painting brushes on large compositions where he stands over them and does what is his moniker, the dripping process, where he basically performs the role of shaman. He often talked about himself like channeling the southwestern Native American tribes and their shamans who would make sand paintings on the ground, kind of communing with nature as they kind of channeled all of their energies to interpreting what they were being told. That's what Pollock is basically doing, or at least that's the way he describes himself. He gets the name Jack the Dripper, based off Jack the Ripper, but that literally helps you remember his process and why we call it gestural abstract expressionism. You can definitely see it's like a recording of a performance, isn't it? Where the drips go, where the things pool up, you get a sense that this was first. Another layer came next. He works his compositions until he gets a consistency that he's happy with, and then the title emerges. He never really seems to start with an aim in mind because performance is part of his process. So you might get something as dense as this. You might get something basically lighter. There are works in the DMA called Cathedral, though there's no reference to a visual cathedral. It's just the color harmonies that seem to suggest that you're in a realm of, Gothic light. So his wife, Lee Krasner, was also an abstract expressionist, and he, along with several others, created basically what's called the New York School. The New York School becomes the center of the universe in the 1950s, and it's all about heavy forms of abstraction. Willem de Kooning is going to join this school. And I use that term loosely. This is basically a group of people who like to get together, drink, and talk late into the evening. So if you know anything about the group, they would do this in New York City. They would go to the Cedar Tavern and have discussions about abstract expressionism late into the evening and how they needed to make a new vocabulary for this new chaos they found themselves in. So basically, you can see Pollock here is going to start with suggesting a new way of making imagery. Willem de Kooning is his contemporary. They were good friends, so they will work together. And sometimes it's hard to tell their work apart from one another. This is an early Willem de Kooning. And he basically said that he was abstracting from a movie still, which was an aerial shot of people moving around in a square. We don't have any visual references anymore to that idea, but he started with the film still and then began to abstract what you saw in it. And what you get here is a frenzied chaos of a large square, but not a depiction of it, right? He was trained classically, so he knew the old world and knew the old school stuff, doing work here that was, just as good as any Dutch Vanitas painting. It's important that you know he was Dutch and that he was an emigre who wanted to explore radical ideas. Here is his wife, Elaine de Kooning, sitting as a subject. So you need to remember he could do naturalism. He could do all of this. Like a Picasso, he's basically capable of doing the old stuff. He just chooses not to because the world has moved on to something entirely different. This is Woman One here. It's a fairly large work and basically a work that his wife said she remembers him working over 200 times. His process, guys, was really interesting. Though it looks gestural and quick, like he would have put it together, slop, 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 and then tried another composition, he was deliberate in his application of the next brushstroke. So he would step to the canvas and make a mark, step back, smoke a cigarette. He would then step back up to the canvas, make a couple of other marks, step back and consider what he had done. So this doesn't represent something that's sloppy or chaotic or sketchy like Impressionism. This is a deliberate combination of color harmonies, and the whole focus is flesh. The pink colors that you see, some of which have been covered up by clothing and other things. I've seen this whole series where the female is standing by a bike, other series where she's kind of semi-reclining. We don't really get much detail about who she is or where she is, but we have enough image and information to know this is a very large-breasted female with a toothy grin and somewhat abstracted, stylized facial features that represent a lot of different influences. For the first that always comes to mind is earlier Paleolithic art, like the Venus of Willendorf. This little 4-inch figurine is one of the earliest works of art known to man, and those forms were becoming more interesting as people learned more and more about them as ways to kind of express the visceral qualities underneath the figures that we see on the outside. Another influence that you're going to recognize, Manet's Olympia. De Kooning actually talked about Manet in many interviews as being kind of a jumping off point where he would study the brushstrokes in her thigh, which if you get close online, you can see those brushstrokes are not blended in. It's not a finished photographic style. And that's exactly what we have here with the de Kooning, a gestural application of paint. and subject matter that he would find very, very interesting. Probably the biggest influence on de Kooning was the contemporary ad campaigns, where he was seeing slick magazine ads of women with smiling faces, rich red lips. He basically was motivated by that image of the female and wanted to start there and then reveal aggressively what was underneath. I'm going to talk about his aggressive brushstrokes. You guys looking at these, you just get a sense in the 1950s that it was a very different reality, right? All the women are in domestic roles, either holding cigarettes or consumer products. So this is right at the time that consumerism kicks into high gear. That'll be important for pop art later. But it's an altered reality where you get these alluring females kind of leading you into a certain kind of ad. You mean a woman can open it? Oh, good Lord. The part that attracted him was what he called the T-zone. And I know some of you are looking at this going, wait a minute, that's not the T-zone. Females today consider the T-zone the brow and the nose, the bridge of the nose. But he was always allured by the mouth and the chin. So he would cut the T-zone out of these magazine articles, paste that on the canvas, and then begin the process of abstracting a figure around that. Eventually, he removed that piece of T fabric. There are some early works by him that still have that magazine clipping in the actual composition. So we know that this was a big influence for him, trying to get at the primordial woman who was enshrined within this 1950s shell. You have lots of different versions of Woman One. There was a whole series that he did in the early 50s. And in these images, I think it's a little bit more apparent that he's working with images of flesh. Ours, maybe not so much, just in the arms or whatever. But that seems to be one of the colors that's pretty predominant in the series. He's working with a new idea of flesh. How to render it, how to use it, how to manipulate the human form. So this really is kind of like the 1950s addition to our long tradition of the female nude in many respects. So if you see any of these, you'll be able to kind of know, yep, these brush strokes, yes, those colorings, that's got to be a de Kooning, right? Especially the subject matter. So lots of those to look at. The idea of him doing this 200 times, he almost felt like the process of making the image was more important than the finished thing itself. So he would definitely work on the idea all day long and then scrape off his work and start over the next day. Some of his canvases are so worn by that process that it's really a conservator's nightmare. So you can look way up in the top edges of some of his compositions, and you'll see in just a second that it almost looks like the canvas is ripped from all of that aggressive attacking of the canvas surface. I use that word aggressive because when people saw this, they thought, oh my God, what is going on with this guy? This is not pretty. It's not attractive. It's visceral at best. And it seems like you can see him literally slapping the canvas and being very aggressive in his application of paint. So people kind of thought this was a rather negative view of the female form. I kind of think it's just another way to express the form. But the 1950s were very different than today. And if you couldn't see something that was attractive or admirable or something that was like based off of a Norman Rockwell, then you kind of had a different view that something was going on with de Kooning. There in the upper right-hand corner, can you guys see the canvas is really edgy, scratchy? It's almost paper thin there because this is one of the works he did over 200 times, according to his wife, painting the thing on, scraping it off with a palette knife, going all the way back to nothing, and then doing the idea again. So he definitely challenged himself in that regard. So there's the tears, the edges, barely. I just imagine if you had a de Kooning like this, you'd be happy to have it in your collection, but you would be constantly worried about it falling apart. Here you can see he and his wife, Elaine de Kooning. I probably should give you just a little biography here, guys. These were very modern couples. These two were married, but they made no bones about the fact that they had lots of extramarital affairs, and that often the models that would sit for de Kooning would eventually become his lovers. Elaine, the same. She would sleep with people who would basically make his reputation stronger, trying to basically forward both of their careers simultaneously. So they were modern in every sense of the word, in that they like kind of free associated with people and influences, and really didn't feel that the old way of living was relevant in this new era where everything could end at any moment. Um, Willem de Kooning does several interviews about this time in his history, and I have some of them posted there for you on the side. And you'll see that he's influenced by everything that's going on in the 1950s, and it's just it can get kind of confusing listening to him. I just want to point out, if you guys look here, you see some drips, you see some panels that are gesturally applied with a brush. That those sketchy features are what kind of connect it to abstract expressionism. Though he has a figure there, it definitely fits within this school. So, in essence, I hope that's enough for you. As we go on, we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of Helen Frankenthaler. So I will leave it there for now, and we will move on in just a second.